Deep inside a Colorado mountain, a young woman stands barefoot on cool stone beside a whispering spring, candlelight catching the tears on her cheeks. Not from sorrow, but from something she has no word for yet. Her husband's hand finds hers in the dimness. Neither speaks. Some discoveries don't need words. They just need witnesses. 3 weeks earlier, Samuel and Rose Vance owned nothing but each other and the creaking wagon they'd borrowed from her uncle. Rose used to say that was plenty. Samuel wanted to believe her, but wanting and believing are different countries, and the road between them is long. What neither of them knew yet was that the mountain ahead was already holding something, waiting, patient as stone, for exactly the right two people to find it. The wagon rolled through the lower reaches of Elk Pass on a bright September morning, the kind of morning that made Colorado look like a painting and feel like a promise. The aspen trees had gone gold early, and the light came through them sideways, warm and flickering, throwing coins of brightness across the trail. Samuel drove with his hat pushed back and his elbows on his knees, studying the ridgeline the way a man studies a problem he hasn't solved yet. He was 22, broad-shouldered and quiet, with the kind of face that trusted slowly and loved deeply. He had married Rose Calloway 6 weeks ago in a church in Pueblo, with 14 people watching and no money in his coat pocket. He hadn't told her about the money, or the lack of it. She had figured it out herself and hadn't mentioned it either. That was one of the things he loved about her. Rose sat beside him, with her dark hair braided back and a wool shawl pulled around her shoulders despite the sun. She was reading aloud from a small journal she kept, not for anyone in particular, just to give the miles some company. She read a description of the mountains she had written at dawn, then stopped mid-sentence and looked up at the peaks above them. "Samuel," she said. "I see it," he said, though he wasn't sure what she meant. "No, look, that wall of rock, the one with the green on it." He looked. A granite face rose up from the slope to their right, thick with moss and shadow, running along the hillside for maybe 200 yards before the trees swallowed it again. It was unremarkable by mountain standards, except for the crack. It was narrow, barely shoulder width, running vertically through the granite from about knee height up to well above a man's head. Dark inside. The moss around its edges was bright green, which meant moisture, which meant something. Samuel pulled the wagon to a stop. Rose closed her journal. They looked at each other, and nothing needed to be decided out loud. He tied the horse to a pine branch and walked to the crack first, pressing one hand flat against the granite. The stone was cool and slightly damp. He leaned in and looked. Darkness, a curve, and then something that might have been a faint brightening beyond. "There's light in there," he said. Rose came up beside him and peered in. "That's not possible." And yet, he turned sideways and stepped into the gap. The stone pressed both shoulders but gave just enough. He moved carefully, one slow step, then another, and then the passage widened slightly, and he called back to her. His voice had changed, opened up, the way voices do in larger spaces. "Rose." A pause. "You need to come in here." She pressed her shawl flat against her chest and stepped inside after him. The passage ran for about 12 feet before it curved gently to the left. Rose kept one hand on the wall and followed Samuel's shape in the dimness ahead of her. The granite was smooth in places, rough in others, and everywhere it smelled of cold mineral water and deep earth. "Samuel, what if it just closes up again? Then we turn around. And what if we can't turn around?" "Rose, I'm asking." "I can see light ahead. There's room." She focused on the back of his shirt. The passage was tighter here, and she had to exhale to move through one particularly narrow section. And for a moment she thought she understood why most people never did this, never followed the strange thing, never pressed through the uncomfortable middle part to find out what was on the other side. It was easier to stay on the trail. The trail was known. But Samuel had already gone still in front of her, and she could hear it in his breathing, that particular held breath quality that meant he had seen something worth holding breath over. She pushed through the last narrow section and came up beside him. The passage had opened, not into a small pocket of rock, not into a shallow dead end, but into a space that stole whatever words she had been preparing. The cavern was perhaps 60 feet across and maybe 40 feet high at its tallest point, and the ceiling was broken in 3 places by natural vertical shafts that sent columns of daylight down into the interior, soft and diffuse and golden, with the particular quality of light that has traveled through stone and moss before arriving. The floor was flat and dry. Along one wall, the sound of moving water, a thin, clear spring threading between 2 low stones and collecting in a shallow natural basin before disappearing into a channel in the rock. And there, set back against the far wall, lit from above by the largest of the light shafts, a cabin. Small, perhaps 1 room, built from timber that had grayed with age but still stood straight. A door with leather hinges, a stone chimney, a window, a single window with the oilskin dried and cracked but still in its frame. Rose said nothing. She breathed. Samuel walked toward it slowly, the way you approach something you're afraid might disappear. Rose followed without thinking, her hand finding the back of his arm. Neither of them spoke until he reached out and touched the door handle, a simple wooden latch, smooth with old use, and pressed it down. The door swung inward on quiet hinges. Inside, stillness and the smell of cedar and dry stone. A single room with everything in it arranged as though the person who lived here had simply stepped out for the afternoon 60 years ago and had simply never come back. They stepped inside together. What neither of them said, standing in the doorway, was the thing that had been following them since Pueblo. Since before Pueblo, really. The quiet fear that love without land was a fragile thing, that wanting a life together and being able to build one were 2 different matters. They had never argued about it. They had never needed to. But it lived in the silences between them, small and persistent. Now, standing inside a room that smelled like cedar and old hope, Rose looked at Samuel and saw that fear beginning, very quietly, to leave his face. The cabin was a single square room, perhaps 14 feet on a side, and it held within it an entire life condensed into its simplest and most essential form. A rope bed frame ran along the left wall, the rope still strung and intact, the tension gone slack with decades, but the frame solid and square. Above it, someone had cut a small niche into the stone wall, not in the wood structure, but in the granite itself, and set into it a smooth river stone, as though it were an ornament or a memorial to a river left behind. Across from the bed, a table, 2 chairs, one with a missing rung, both still standing. The table was set against the wall beneath a shelf that held a row of objects, a tin cup, a folded piece of cloth, dark with age, a short-handled knife with an antler grip, a ceramic jar with a cork stopper, and in the center of the shelf, as though it had been placed with intention and left with intention, a folded piece of paper. Samuel went to the shelf first and lifted the paper carefully. It was brittle at the folds, yellowed through to the color of old honey, but it had been kept dry, and the ink, though faded, was legible. Rose went to the fireplace while he read. The chimney was real stone, mortared together with care, and the firebox had been swept clean. Beside it, a neat stack of firewood, dry as chalk. A cast-iron pot rested on the iron hook inside. She reached up and felt the flue with her fingertips. Open, she thought. Open and clear. Rose, Samuel said. She turned. He was holding the letter out to her, his expression difficult to read. Not quite disbelief, not quite hope, something thinner and more careful than either. She took the paper and read. The handwriting was careful and small, slightly tilted to the right. The kind of handwriting that comes from teaching yourself. It began without a salutation, addressed to no one, and therefore to anyone. If you have found this place, then you have done what I spent 3 months learning to do. You pushed through the passage and trusted what you couldn't see yet. That says something about you that I hope you'll remember. The letter went on to describe the cabin's construction. The writer had spent 2 summers building it, cutting timber from the trees above the pass and working them down through the passage piece by piece. The spring, he explained, ran year-round without fail. He had tested it through 2 winters. The cabin retained warmth well because the surrounding rock held temperature, and the ceiling shafts could be partially blocked with stone plugs he had fashioned and left stacked just outside the entrance. Rose had walked past them without noticing, thinking them natural formations. He described the land above as unregistered territory. He had surveyed it himself. A man with knowledge of the General Land Office might be able to file on the surrounding acreage without difficulty. Then, toward the bottom of the page, his tone changed. It became quieter, more careful. I built this for a family I did not end up having. I am old now, and my legs will not bring me back through the passage, and I have made my peace with that. But I will not see this place fall to nothing. Whoever you are, whoever finds this, I am giving it to you. Not lending. Giving. Put your names in whatever record you keep, and call it yours, because that is what it is. I built it with my hands, and I am leaving it with my heart, and I hope it gives you what it could not give me. A start. It was not signed with a full name, only initials and a year. W.H., 1841. Rose stood holding the letter for a long moment without speaking. Then she folded it carefully along its original creases and held it against her chest. 42 years, she said. He built it for us, Samuel said. He just didn't know our names yet. They spent the rest of that first afternoon the way people spend time in places they cannot yet believe are real, slowly and with their hands. Samuel found the stone plugs outside the entrance, just as the letter described, smooth-fitted and ingeniously simple, and he carried 4 of them inside and examined the ceiling shafts. 2 of the shafts had corresponding plug niches carved into the stone near them. The plugs fit with a satisfying completeness that spoke of careful workmanship, of a man who had learned from his own mistakes before getting it right. Samuel left them open for now. The light was too good to waste. Rose went through the shelf systematically. The ceramic jar held cornmeal, dry and sealed well enough that it crumbled rather than rotted. Not usable, but preserved in spirit. The tin cup was sound. The cloth was a small piece of wool, possibly cut from a blanket, soft still along one edge. The knife, when she tested it with her thumbnail, held an edge, a real one, properly kept. She found a wooden crate beneath the bed, pushed against the wall. Inside, a coil of rope in good condition, a small draw knife still sharp, A wrapped bundle that turned out to be 4 candles, beeswax, dry and unlit, a glass jar with a sealed wax lid that held, when she finally worked it open, something she couldn't immediately identify. Small, dark, dried. She brought it to the light. "Dried apples," she said suddenly. "Samuel, these are dried apples." He came over and peered into the jar. "Can't possibly still be." She lifted one and bit it carefully. Her expression shifted through caution into surprise into something genuine. "They're sweet," she said. She held one out to him. He chewed it slowly. That man knew how to seal a jar. He knew how to do a great many things. They ate 3 apple pieces each and left the rest, as though they understood without discussing it that the jar should be kept. Not for the apples, for the feeling of it. The spring deserved its own attention. Samuel knelt beside the basin and cupped water in his hands and drank without ceremony. It was cold and clean, with a faint mineral quality, and it had the taste that deep source water has, the taste of something that has never seen weather. "Better than anything we carried," he said. Rose sat on the stone edge of the basin and trailed her fingers in the current. The water moved without hurry, threading in from a seam in the rock to the left and out through a channel to the right. There was no standing water, no stagnation, only constant, gentle motion. The sound it made was so quiet it was almost no sound at all, more like the idea of water than the noise of it. Above them, through the ceiling shafts, the light was beginning to gold and lean toward afternoon. The cavern's temperature had not changed since they arrived. Samuel stood and looked at the ceiling, then at the walls, then at the cabin again. "The rock holds the heat," he said. "He wrote that. It holds cold out and holds warmth in." "In winter?" Rose said. "Better in winter, I'd guess. The stone would buffer both directions." Rose stood and walked back to the cabin doorway and leaned against the frame, looking at the room. The rope bed, the table, the 2 chairs, the swept hearth. She looked at it the way she had looked at the mountains that morning, like a thing too large to take in whole, but too real to look away from. "We could sleep here tonight," she said. It was not a question exactly, more like trying the idea aloud to see how it sounded. Samuel looked at her. "The wagon's still out there. I know. Horse needs feeding. I know that too." He walked to the table and pulled out one of the chairs and sat down. Then he looked at the empty chair across from him. "We'll feed the horse," he said, "and then we'll sleep here tonight." Rose sat down across from him. They went out as the sun dropped behind the western ridge, the shadows long and cool across the trail. Samuel unhitched the horse and led her to a patch of grass and got water from the barrel in the wagon. Rose found the small oil lantern they kept under the bench and a box of matches and a half-wheel of hard cheese, and she cut 3 slices and wrapped them in cloth. When they went back inside, through the passage, through the dark, through the curve, and out into the cavern again, something had changed. Not the cabin, not the light, which was nearly gone now. Something in how it felt to arrive. The doubts came that night, as doubts tend to, in the quiet after the immediate wonder has settled. Samuel lit 2 of the beeswax candles and set them on the table. And while Rose arranged their blankets on the rope bed, he sat with a stub of pencil and a scrap of paper and tried to put down what he knew in terms that held together under examination. The letter was real. The date was real. The construction was real. But a letter in a box was not a deed, and a deed was not land, and land in Colorado Territory in 1883 was not simply a thing a man could declare his own because someone long dead had told him to. There were land offices. There were surveys. There were forms filed in triplicate, and fees, and waiting periods, and the particular formidable machinery of government that existed specifically to regulate exactly this kind of situation. He didn't know how to file a land claim. He had never done it. He knew the words: the Homestead Act, the General Land Office. He had heard men talk about them in Pueblo, in Salida, in every town they'd passed through where men gathered and talked about the land. But knowing the words and knowing the process were not the same. He had no money for fees if there were fees. He did not know where the nearest land office was. He did not know if a man could file on land that held a natural formation, a cavern, a spring, or if such land fell into some other category entirely, some federal territory reserved or excluded or complicated in ways he couldn't predict. And underneath all of that, quieter but harder to dismiss, what if someone else had already filed? What if the initials WH corresponded to a name in some record, and that name corresponded to an estate, and that estate had heirs who had never found the cabin but might still have a legal interest in the land above it? What if they built something here, planted their hopes here, put their names on this place in their own hearts, and then someone arrived one spring morning with papers? He didn't say any of this to Rose while she was making up the bed. There was no point saying it tonight, when there was nothing to be done about it tonight. But she came and sat beside him at the table and looked at his paper, which was covered in small, precise notations and question marks, and she read it in silence. "The county seat," she said. "There'll be a land office." "I know. We can get there in 2 days from here." "I know that too." "Samuel." She put her hand over the paper, not over his hand, over the paper specifically, covering the questions. "We found this place this morning. We've known it exists for..." She glanced at the candle. 9 hours. Whatever needs to be done, whatever the process is, whatever it costs, we can figure that out. But right now, we know it's here, and we know what the letter says, and we know no one else is in it. He looked at her hand on the paper. "I just don't want to," he started. "I know," she said. "I know what you don't want, but you can't protect us from a possibility by worrying about it tonight." She stood and picked up one of the candles. "Come to bed. The land office will be there in the morning." He looked at the cabin walls, at the chimney, at the stone niche above the bed with its single river stone. He folded the paper and put it in his coat pocket. Morning brought no immediate answers, but it brought light, and light in that cavern was its own kind of reassurance. The ceiling shafts let in the early sun at a different angle than the afternoon, sharper and more direct, and the effect was something neither of them had expected. The interior of the cavern at dawn was brighter than at midday, the columns of light cutting clean and white across the stone floor, the spring catching them and scattering them in small pieces across the walls. Rose was awake first. She lay still in the rope bed for several minutes, listening to the water and looking at the light, understanding in a slow and wordless way that this was what it would be like to wake up here. Not once, not as travelers, but as the people who lived here. The understanding arrived not as a thought, but as a feeling in the chest. Something between gratitude and vertigo. She rose and went to the spring and washed her face and hands and stood in one of the light columns for a moment with her eyes closed. Samuel found her there. He stood in the doorway of the cabin and watched her, and the expression on his face was one she had not seen before. Not quite happiness, not quite relief. Something older and quieter than either. The expression of a man watching something fall into place. But the practical world did not pause for feelings. After breakfast, hardtack and the remaining dried apple pieces, eaten at the table with the candles out and daylight more than sufficient. Samuel spread his notes on the table again, and they worked through it together. The nearest land office, by his best reckoning from maps he'd studied in Salida, was in Gunnison, perhaps 40 miles, 2 days by wagon on mountain roads. The question of fees. He had $11.40 in his coat lining. He did not know if that was enough. He did not know what the fee schedule was. He did not know what documents were required, whether the letter from WH would carry any weight, or whether it would simply be noted and set aside as an unverifiable artifact. The question of prior claims, harder to resolve without access to records. But Rose had a thought. "The letter says 1841, she said. If anyone had filed on this land after he wrote it, they'd have found the cabin, or found the passage at least. Someone would have noted it. There'd be a record of it. Unless they found it and didn't know what to do with it either, then there'd still be no competing claim filed." She smoothed the map flat with her palm. "We're the same as every other person who's come to this territory and looked at a piece of land and decided to ask for it. We just happened to find ours in an unusual place." He considered this for a moment. It was a reasonable framing. It was perhaps even correct. "I want to take the letter with us," he said. "To Gunnison. Of course. And I want to write down, today, now, before we leave, a description of this place. Where it is, what's in it, what the letter says, in our own words, in our own hand, dated today. Like a record. Like a record." Rose took the pencil from him and pulled a clean page from her journal. She began to write. Her handwriting was better than his. She had been taught by a particular third-grade teacher who had considered penmanship a moral matter, and she wrote precisely and fully, including measurements she estimated by pacing and details Samuel supplied from memory. When she finished, they both signed it. 2 hours later, with the horse hitched and the wagon ready, and the letter and their own written record tucked carefully into the inner pocket of Samuel's coat, they stood at the entrance to the passage and looked at the crack in the granite wall. It looked smaller from the outside. Insignificant, the kind of thing a person walks past without slowing. Samuel said very quietly, "What if we come back and it's gone?" Rose looked at him. "It's a mountain, Samuel." "I know, but what if?" She looked at the crack. She understood what he meant. Not the mountain. The feeling. What if the feeling was the thing that disappeared? They drove the first 5 miles in near silence, the wagon rocking on the descent from the pass, the aspen trees thinning as the altitude dropped. Samuel kept his hand on the inside pocket of his coat, over the letter, not constantly but returning to it, a habitual checking, the way a man touches his wallet or his watch, reassuring himself of the continued presence of something important. Rose watched the road and thought about the river stone in the niche above the bed. Someone had carried it up through that passage. Not a small trip, not an easy one, and set it in a niche carved by hand from granite, for no reason except that a home should have something in it that was chosen rather than functional. That it should be, in some sense, a place. She thought about WH. She thought about what it must have been to build that cabin alone and then leave it. To write that letter and fold it and place it on the shelf and walk out through the passage knowing it was the last time, because the legs that had carried you through it every day for 20 years would not carry you through it anymore. She thought, someone spent a life making that possible for us. She thought, we owe it to him to be brave enough to try. She said none of this. It didn't need saying. On the morning of the second day, With Gunnison visible as a line of rooftops in the valley below, Rose opened her journal to a fresh page and wrote, at the top, Vance Claim, Elk Pass, Colorado Territory. Filed in the year 1883. She left the rest of the page blank, to be filled in later. Samuel looked over and read it and said nothing for a moment. Then he clicked the horse forward. Let's go get our home, he said. The land office in Gunnison occupied the front room of a 2-story building on the main street, with a hand-lettered sign in the window and the smell of paper and ink that all such offices share, as though documentation has its own permanent climate. The agent was a compact man named Aldrich, with steel-rimmed glasses and a methodical quality to his movements. He placed things on desks parallel to their edges. He squared papers before he read them. He was the kind of man who had built his working life around precision and was settled in it. Samuel laid the letter on the counter. Aldrich read it without touching it first, bending slightly forward over the glass. 1841, he said. Yes, sir. You've seen the structure yourself. We spent the night in it. Aldrich looked up briefly, then back at the letter. He straightened and went to a large flat cabinet against the far wall and opened a drawer and pulled out a survey map that he spread across the counter with practiced efficiency. His finger moved across it, tracing the contour lines of the pass. This region here, he said, tapping, has not been registered. I can confirm that now. There is no filed claim on any portion of this land going back to territorial records, which begin in 1861. He paused. If a man named W.H. built on this land in 1841, he did so before any system existed to record it, which means the land itself is still open. And the cabin? Rose said. Aldrich looked at her over his glasses. Improvements made on open land are a consideration, not a barrier, particularly when they are inherited or transferred through documentation. He tapped the letter again. This letter, as legal instruments go, is unorthodox, but it establishes intent, and intent, combined with your physical presence and use of the property, establishes something courts have been willing to consider. He allowed himself a brief, almost indiscernible expression that was the professional equivalent of a smile. You would not be the first couple to file on the strength of a found letter. The paperwork took most of that day. There were forms, several of them, in triplicate, exactly as Samuel had feared, though the fee was $8 rather than more, which left him $3.40, and the relief of a man who was braced for worse. Aldrich asked for descriptions of the property's features, and Rose provided them from her journal with the measured precision of someone who had been paying close attention. The spring was noted. The cabin dimensions were noted. The existence of the ceiling shafts and their function were described and recorded. The letter from W.H. was copied by hand, both sides, and the copy retained while the original was returned to Samuel, who put it back in his inside pocket. Aldrich filed the papers at the end of the day. Provisionally registered, he said, stamping two of the forms. Subject to a surveyor's visit in the spring, which is standard. But you are on the record as of today. He handed Samuel a copy of the registration. Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Vance. It appears you own a mountain. He said it without irony, which made it better. They drove back in weather that had turned mild and golden, the kind of early autumn afternoon that the Colorado mountains occasionally produce as a kind of apology for the winters ahead. The aspens were fully turned now, and the road through the pass was ankle-deep in yellow leaves that the wagon moved through with a soft, continuous brushing sound. Samuel drove with the registration folded in his shirt pocket and his hat pushed back. Rose sat close enough that their shoulders touched, which was not strictly necessary given the bench's width, but which neither of them adjusted. She had the journal open on her lap and was writing, but she kept stopping to look at the trees. "What are you writing?" he asked. "Everything," she said. "While it's still new?" He looked at the ridgeline. "It's not going to stop being new for a while, I think." "I know, but the first new is different. You can't get it back once it's ordinary." He thought about that. W.H. probably felt it when he first found the passage. He must have. She was quiet a moment. "I think about him a lot." "I do too. I want to find out who he was, if there's any way. Whatever records there might be. If we find out, we should put his name somewhere, in the cabin." She turned to look at him. "The niche," she said. "Above the bed. The river stone's already there. We could put his initials beside it." She wrote that down. They reached the passage as the sun dropped behind the western ridge for the second time, the light going amber and long across the granite face. The horse was patient as Samuel tied her to the same pine branch. The wagon sat where they'd left it, undisturbed. They stood for a moment in front of the crack. It looked the same as it had 2 days ago. Narrow, dark, the moss bright at its edges, the interior invisible until you committed to entering it. A thing you could walk past without noticing. A thing that asked something of you before it offered anything in return. Samuel held out his hand. Rose took it. They went through side by side, not quite possible at the narrowest point, which required Rose to go first and Samuel to follow, but close enough to count. The passage curved left in the dimness. The air changed, cooler, stiller, carrying the mineral smell of water and deep stone. And then the cavern opened around them, and the last of the day's light came down through the ceiling shafts in 3 long columns, and the spring moved quietly in the dark corner, and the cabin stood in the soft golden light, its door still open from when they had left it. Their home, not borrowed, not temporary, theirs, given by a stranger who had trusted the passage and the kind of people it selects. Samuel exhaled slowly. Rose stepped forward first this time, moving across the stone floor toward the open door, her footsteps barely audible in the vast quiet of the mountain. He followed. The door swung inward. Later that evening, with a small fire burning in the stone hearth and the 2 beeswax candles lit on the table, Rose sat on the edge of the rope bed and wrote the last entry of the day in her journal. Samuel was asleep already, one arm folded under his head, his breathing even and unhurried. She wrote, "We are home. It is inside a mountain, and it has a spring, and a stranger built it for us 42 years before we were born. I do not know what to call what we are feeling, but I know we will spend a long time living inside it." She closed the journal and blew out the candles.
Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. It genuinely means everything to me. I hope the story kept you company and carried you somewhere new for a little while. If you enjoyed it, please consider giving the video a hype and dropping a comment below letting me know where in the world you're watching from. I always love reading those, and it never stops amazing me how far these stories travel. If this is your first time here, welcome. There are plenty more stories waiting for you on the channel, so feel free to explore. And if you've been here before, thank you for coming back. It means more than you know. Sharing the video with a friend who loves a good story is a wonderful way to support the channel too. I'll see you in the next one. Take care of yourself.